They watched him fall as if the prairie had nothing left to give. The rider's horse staggered, then bolted, leaving a scatter of hooves and a man crumpled against the hard sun-baked grass. Silver Ridge watched from porches and hitching posts, shaded faces turned inward like shutters closing against a storm. Only one woman moved. Elinor Hale came across the field with a speed that made the town seem slower than it was. She had come to Silver Ridge to teach and to keep herself small. Teaching children gave shape to the rest of the days that the war had left ragged. But something in the sight of a body alone on the prairie called the old profession back to her. Hands that knew how to stop bleeding. A mind that could think ahead for someone who could not. Crowds parted with a soft rustle as she crossed the last stretch, skirts brushing the grass, dark hair pinned back under a faded bonnet. Her eyes were steady, practiced, the way a person learns to hold a line even while feeling the ground tilt beneath them. He was younger than she guessed at first, late 20s, tall, a jaw that had been tamed by weather and work rather than polish. Blood darkened the collar of his shirt where he had come down on his chest. In the brief, raw way of a struck animal, he blinked and found her face. For a moment, the world narrowed to the cloth in her hands and the clean, sure rope of her voice. She knew how to work quickly. She knew what would wait and what would not. She tore a strip from her own apron, pressed it to his wound, and spoke to him like someone trying to keep fear from swelling. "Hold," she said. "If you can, that's enough. Keep your breath steady." The shout of the nearest man, "Someone fetch a doctor," had been the only other sound. Now it was the soft shuffle of shoes and the clink of a kettle being set down by someone with trembling hands. Elinor's touch was quick and efficient. She bundled, bound, cooled the fevered skin with water, kept him awake with questions she did not expect answers to. She had been a nurse in far worse places than a prairie, but the sight of patched leather and a man who had fallen at a distance made old memories come like nicked steel. A trench, the smell of smoke, the metallic bitter tang of blood on tongue. She tamped those shapes down and focused on the here, on the cough, the shallow breath, the way his fingers flexed and then stilled. He woke to lamplight, to the smell of boiled tea, to the tick of a clock in a boarding house that smelled of starch and cinnamon. He opened his eyes, slow as the lifting of a curtain. The room had the small, close warmth of other people's care. A fire burned low in the grate. For the first time since he had given out on the prairie, he saw her properly, the plates of her cheekbones, the small line where her lip had been scarred and never quite softened, a ragged pale thread at her wrist that was not there by accident. It startled him, this proof of an earlier life not written in words. She watched him watch her. There was no flourish, no story offered, just the plainness of a woman who had learned how to answer the simplest question. "I nursed in the war," she said, as if that explained nothing and everything at once. "We lost men who should have survived. She stopped. The sentence caught on some remembered name or a face he did not need to know. Her fingers, the hands he had felt on his ribs, tightened around a cup she had set on a tray. He saw the scars then, pale ridges along the forearm, a faint line curving under her collar where a splinter had gone deep and left more than flesh behind. The scars were not grotesque. They were honest as calluses, the record of someone who had given time and body to others until the self had become an instrument. The sight hit him with a clarity he had not expected. There is a kind of looking that reads a life, how a person moves, how they dress the dead or the wounded, the steadiness in the face when everything else trembles. And in that reading, he saw not a stranger, but an ally. He inhaled as someone who had been privy to a secret. He braided that sudden knowledge into a vow, and the vow slid out of him small and sure as a coin placed on a palm. "I'll keep you safe," he said. It was not poetry. It was not a man's boast. It was a promise guided by a simple, old-fashioned conviction. If someone had helped him when the town would not, then his obligation was plain. Elinor's eyes widened, not because she doubted him, but because vows should be measured. He saw that and added, with the bluntness of one who had had the world cut away from him and learned how to hold on, "I mean it. I won't let anyone—" He stopped at an image of men in suits and boots and the quiet cruelty of a town that defers to money. She smiled, a small twist that had more grief in it than gratitude. "When I see someone dying, I help," she said. There was no flourish. It was a fact, a phrase worn into the habit of her life. His promise did not make the past tidy, nor did it mend what the scarred wrists could not forget. But it made a shape where there had been only chance, two people adrift, tethered now by the kind of obligation that does not announce itself. Outside, in the thin light of late afternoon, someone stepped back from the porch steps and coughed. Gossip is a slow engine that runs on nothing more than the observation that one life is now tied to another. Silver Ridge began to turn its head. If this kind of story of quiet courage and stubborn truth draws you in, go ahead and like and subscribe. There are more long-form tales of small towns and hard choices coming. They put him in Mary Chen's boarding house because Mary had room and a mind made generous by loss. She kept a ledger for the town's meals and secret sympathy folded into tidy meals. Mary fussed and scolded and offered ginger tea that tasted like the inside of a warm fist. She had a way of making strangers feel like kin quickly enough that they would not notice the seams. Caleb, he gave his name on a breath, as if naming things was part of reclaiming them, ate slowly and watched Elinor as if he were learning a map. He had come to Silver Ridge with a family grievance and the stubbornness of a man who farmed by seasons. He had not meant to fall from his horse and become someone else's debt. Langford first came with a carriage and a smile cut to fit a ledger. Victor Langford owned the mine at the rim of town and the houses that leaned into it. He owned the men who worked for him in the sense that he owned their wages and the habits by which they measured risk. His hat was never ragged, and his voice had the kind of smoothness that sat well with those who wished to be polished by association. He did not ride with a fury, he moved like a tide that had been patient for a long time. The rumor that Langford believed Caleb responsible for a recent cave-in greeted him before he did. Silver Ridge liked explanations because they turned hazard into story. Langford provided enough detail, that the collapse had been deliberate, that someone had loosened a support, that this sort of sabotage could not go unpunished. His words were measured, but there was an iron core, and people liked the solidity of someone who would use a strong hand where it was called for. The question of safety, mine safety, the safety of paychecks, of livelihoods, made most heads nod. Elinor's presence complicated that neatness. A woman who saved a man the town suspected of wrongdoing was an inconvenient fact for men who preferred to believe their town had order. She interfered with an arrest, one neighbor said on the first morning, as if Elinor had thrown herself between a man and forces beyond him. A stranger, stepping in. Others nodded with that peculiar public morality that sees charity as risk. The school board met in the town hall because there was no other place to convene the town's conscience. The room smelled faintly of ink and wood polish. The board sat high, solemn in the way civics try to hold law as if paper could be armor. Margaret Thornton, who had a seat and the sort of careful face that had learned to keep books and people in order, presided. She had been a pillar once, or as near a pillar as Silver Ridge allowed itself to have, and she could not imagine the idea that a teacher's presence could be a hazard. Yet the county inspector had written about inappropriate associations, and Langford had whispered names into ears that trusted him. Elinor came to the meeting because she would not be pushed aside without speaking. She stood in front of the faces that represented the town, and felt a weight like a cold stone settle in her stomach. "I will not abandon my pupils," she said simply. "If I see a life in danger, I act. They learn more from that than from a book." Her voice was steady. Behind her, a few of the mothers shifted in their seats. They could see their children in the girl she was protecting. A handful of men, who had taken up Langford's cause, shifted their chairs toward the door, and assumed the rightness of their posture. Langford did not shout. He did not need to. He let his lawyer speak of impropriety, of risk to the town's standing. He hinted that if the town turned against him, the jobs would go with it. His threat was a thing made of possibility rather than a raised voice. The school board listened. The board liked order. It preferred a town silent and fed to a town loud and messy. They voted to place Elinor on a short probation, 3 months, pending review, because it allowed everyone to call themselves fair while waiting to see if the world outside would tilt toward trouble. Caleb's anger was slow and domestic in its heat. He moved like a man who had kept cattle through storms. His thoughts were practical, and his fists unclenched more often than his words did. He came to the meeting after rest, and a night's fever had dulled to a bruise. He sat in the back with his hat on his knee, and did not speak until Margaret Thornton rose to make another polite, careful point. When she paused, he stood. The room took the small, surprised breath of those unused to being addressed. "She saved me," he said. His voice was steady, his jaw set. "If none of you would lift a hand, she did. That is why she'll keep her post." He did not plead for privilege. He did not ask for exception. He stated a fact. Her action mattered. His presence was a quiet force. Langford's smile tightened for a second. It released and stayed cordial. The board voted anyway for probation, measured, safe, but the town had seen the shape of resistance. In those days that followed, the threads of the town's life wound around small acts. Elinor taught. She tied little bloodstains on fingers with a calm that made children trust her. Caleb did chores and paid for meals with the small economy of someone setting up roots. A load of hay, a repair to a fence. Between them they learned the grammar of each other. How Elinor startled at sharp sounds, and how she could sit with a man for hours and say nothing as long as his breathing eased. How Caleb watched edges for danger, and how his hands, rough with rope, were surprisingly deft at placing a child's hair behind an ear. Dr. Morrison visited because a retired physician could not let a man who had fallen in the open go without a careful eye. He had white hair combed back and a mind that still liked the algebra of symptoms. He kept a notebook that was more habit than need. He wrote with a slow, careful script. When he drew his hand across the page, it was as if the past took shape. Dates, small observations, a remark about scar tissue and fever. In Dr. Morrison's study, the light slanted in and bowed like an old apology. "There is infection to watch," he told Elinor in one low conversation that smelled of peppermint and liniment. "But he's got a good constitution. He'll mend." He paused, studying the man in the next room as if gauging whether the marrow held. "There are oddities in the reports I've been shown," he added finally, with the professional's gentleness that betrays concern without naming the fear. "Not all accidents read the same. Patterns show if you look." Elinor listened and filed the comment away like a seed. She had come to Silver Ridge to stitch things back into a life that had been torn. She had not come thinking she would be a witness to a legal truth, but the habit of noting what did not fit, had been practiced in wards with too many bodies. She learned to read ledger entries and the look of timbers in a shaft by the same human instinct. When Margaret Thornton stopped her on the street and said, in a voice that trembled like paper, "I heard them say the shaft supports were shoddy, cheaper wood, put there to save a sum." The seeds sprouted. Margaret's hands were never unsteady before. Now they fiddled with the edge of her bonnet. "You didn't hear that from me," she whispered. "People know, but they are frightened." The fear in Silver Ridge was not some grand conspiracy. It was 1,000 small calculations. Men were renters, fathers, carriers of mortgages. They weighed the possibility of speaking against the certainty of work. Langford knew this. It is the advantage of entanglement. People do not like to pull the thread if the cloth might come loose. He did not need to coerce so much as to remind, jobs can vanish. Food will not admit moral inconveniences. He offered a vision of stability, payroll, safe roads, enough money to buy one more plow, and the town liked its image of survival. John Spencer, a foreman at the mine, made the first real break with language when a ledger slipped into Elinor's hands like a confession. He did not offer it to her in a crowd. He left a small bundle at Mary Chen's door, a sheaf of papers, stamped and scrawled, a hand that had been forced to write numbers that did not match what his conscience told him. Spencer was not a hero by temperament. He had a wife with a cough and a boy who needed boots. He had, however, a limit. That limit had been reached when men in the shaft had asked him to make a report that did not square with the timbers he had seen. He had seen men leave the shaft with an uneasy look and return it no longer. When Elinor unfolded the papers, they were a map of choices. Orders for cheaper timber, receipts that had been doctored, a notation that an inspection had passed, though the marks in the margins hinted at rush. There were names in the margins, clerks who had signed, an engineer with a dog-eared reputation. She did not understand every number, but the sense of a paper trail was a wind that opened a room. Dr. Morrison read the ledger and nodded slowly. "This is a start," he said, and in the way a doctor writes a prescription, he indicated how to proceed. Notes kept, witnesses located, dates recorded. He taught her how to frame a question so a courthouse would answer. Langford felt the first edging of a threat in the way his stableman looked at him differently one morning. A man who runs a town's work cannot have his men look at him and decide to question the ledger. He could not afford suspicion. He moved through the town with his polished persuasion, visiting Reverend Mitchell on Sunday, talking of charity and a company's duty, offering donations that would make the green of the churchyard brighter. Those gestures are the cloth a town uses to cover the seams. Caleb watched all this as a man who keeps his pain on a leash. There was an old photograph in his mind. No, not a photograph, a memory. The mine kitchen when he was a boy, the table heavy with bread because men in suits had decided someone had to dig. His family had been there generations. He knew the sound of ledger pen on paper like a clock winding. He understood what truth would do if it was turned loose. It would not only bruise a man who had enough money to rebuild, it would bruise families, take work, close doors. He thought of his brother Jamie, who would look to him for guidance without asking for it. To protect Elinor was to bring risk to those he loved. Night brought tremors. Elinor woke sometimes with her heart a drum in her throat, hands still moving as if bandaging. She kept a lamp by her bed, and would sit with the soft light tremor of a person who had learned new vigilance. Caleb watched her at such hours, once sitting at her window with the light of a lantern between them, the dark field beyond like a promise or a threat. He had sworn to protect her in a moment of gratitude and need. He had not fully measured what protecting her might mean. The loss of comfort, the scorn of neighbors, the attentions of a man who owned a mine and feared humiliation more than law. On a night when the moon was a thin coin in the sky, Caleb went down to the corral and found two men standing there as if waiting for him. They were young enough to keep a watch and old enough to know how to look like they belonged. They said politely that Mr. Langford sent his regards and that trouble could be kept small if men minded their place. Their words were a soft warning delivered in the almost audience of an empty corral. Caleb listened because he had to, and because there is a kind of courage that is the slow arranging of things. He told Elinor the morning after, without drama. They'd like to keep things tidy, he said. He used the plain furniture of speech because his life had been built of such things. She put a hand over his knuckles, which were raw and calloused. I knew that would come, she said. This is what he wants. To make us choose our fear. She rested her head on the back of the chair as if weighing two kinds of tired. The first small fracture in the town's quiet came when an anonymous letter was pinned to the notice board outside the general store. A simple list of names and dates, insinuation thin as thread. It did not name Langford, but the implication was heavy. People read it and folded their paper as if putting the letter away was the same as burying the idea. Margaret Thornton went pale. Reverend Mitchell read without comment and turned to the closing hymn as if that could be armor. At the foundry, as iron cooled and men of calloused hands swapped the day's gossip, John Spencer put his hand on the ledger and felt the weight of his signature. He had left the papers with Mary because he could not bear to say the words aloud. The papers moved like a small explosion through a small town. Where once the public debate had been about jobs and good order, now it became about who would stand to be honest. Langford moved as a man who had only one more card to play before he would call the bank's favors. The local sheriff, who had a public face of law and a private ledger of debts. Sheriff Porter had been elected for being reasonable. He had always thought of law as a thing to be applied without breaking the town. He had taken dinners at Langford's table, smiles given, and received the same. Porter saw resistance as a furnace where tools are shaped. He told people that federal inspectors might be called in if the descent did not stop. That was a line he had learned to say in public to keep men from panic. To the faithful, it sounded like caution. To the frightened, it sounded like threat. Caleb, who had risen that morning to mend a fence, felt the bile of obligation. To protect a woman was not a hero's banner, but a man taking a risk that might cost him everything. He had not counted on fear being contagious. He had not counted on a town's appetite for order being stronger than its appetite for truth. The vow that had been a small private tether had already begun to feel like a chain whose links were forged out of other men's livelihoods. He and Elinor had a conversation that was less like a decision than a mutual drawing up of plans. They spoke of small things, how to keep his name clear, how to find witnesses, how to keep the children safe in a school that might become a battleground for adult fears. They catalogued the resources they had. Dr. Morrison's notebook, Margaret's ears, Spencer's bundle of papers. and a sympathetic journalist in Denver who might see the story without the same small-town loyalties. The idea of going to Denver was both hope and a calculation. Hope that someone with a newspaper might force a larger power to look. Calculation that such attention would also bring Langford's wrath. "Whatever comes," Caleb told her one evening, as a wind gathered over the ridge and the house rocked faintly. "We won't back down because I'm afraid." Elinor looked at him. "You don't have to be unafraid," she said. "You just have to be constant." She squeezed his hand and let the silence hold the rest. There was another thing she did not say. Truth is a stairway that, once begun, will reveal more steps than you intended. In the ledger margins were lines that suggested a deeper rot. Receipts signed for timber that had not been purchased. A note in a pencil scrawl that referenced an inspector's signature, and a time when the ledger clerk had been distracted. Each oddity hinted at a process. Each process suggested a man who preferred comfort to compliance. A courier from Denver came into town a week later with a folded newspaper in his saddlebags and a willingness to listen. He had the look of those who take trains and cities into their bones, a faster cadence that made the town feel slow and provincial, but also necessary. He sipped the offered coffee and listened to Elinor and Dr. Morrison as they laid out the ledger and the pattern. He had a pen and a mind for story, and what he offered in his clipped metropolitan voice was neither poetry nor promise but practicality, a column, a name under a byline, a light shone on facts. Langford felt the first crack as a very quiet annoyance that was worse than any outrage. He met with his counsel and measured out a legal response. Notices to the school board, threats of defamation, reminders to the sheriff about order, and the company line that any hint of sabotage was a crime. He did not see himself as evil. He saw himself as the custodian of industry in a place where industry and town were woven together by necessity. In his mind, the ledger was not a confession, but the scribble of frightened men who did not understand the business of running a livelihood. He meant to defend against the public shame, to preserve jobs, to maintain his name. Caleb learned that vows become heavier by the day, and that protection is not merely muscle, but the slow work of gathering allies and of walking into courts of reason. When Langford's men came to the boarding house once in the dark and left a thin warning, an unsigned note slipped under the door. Caleb did not rage. He burned the note and put it out with the coals. Anger was a luxury best spent where it could be of use. He went instead to Dr. Morrison and asked about the medical testimony he might give if asked. He went to Margaret and asked what more she could recall about the men who signed the receipts. He walked through town like a man making a list. There had been, in the first days after the rescue, an intimacy that needed neither language nor ceremony. He had vowed to protect her when he had seen the lines at her wrist and the stale grief in her face. He thought his vow would be tested by men like Langford or by a court's cold ink. He did not yet know that it would be tested by truth itself, that learning the ledger's story would call for citizens to choose between money and conscience, that asking for evidence would make people feel exposed, that protecting Elinor would mean calling a town to account, and that the town would not meet that call without pain. The first part of their plan was simple. Gather what could be gathered, secure press that could thrust light on what otherwise would be folded by polite mercy, and keep the school open so the children would not be punished for the adults' failures. They moved quietly, each act deliberate. They did not yet speak of trials or indictments. They spoke of papers and people and timetables. To Elinor, every name remembered, and every margin note was a stitch. To Caleb, every step meant fewer surprises, for the truth would not remain a quiet thing. Late one afternoon, as the light slanted like old coin across the floors of the boarding house, a man from the mine passed through town with a look that told of a man who had been told to look away. He had the weary, habitual guilt of someone who signs a paper with the same hand that feeds his family. His eyes met Elinor's for a fraction of a second, and in that second she read a decision. He would not speak in public, perhaps never, but the ledger in Mary Chen's chest had found a way to be known. The torrent of small acts was beginning. Caleb stood on the edge of the porch that evening and watched the field where he had fallen weeks ago. His vow sat like a weight and like a compass. History had put him where he could act, and he had chosen to act. He had promised to keep this scarred woman safe. He had not promised it would be easy. He had not yet met the truth in full, the ledger lines and the names and the legal machinery that would be required to bring them into the light. For now, the vow was a quiet thing between them, and the town rolled on, with its hems fraying in places where money had cut corners. At the edge of the night, a carriage rolled into town, muffled by the damp of the coming rain. Langford watched from his study window as it approached, and his face was that pale thing of a man who discovers a stone in his shoe, an annoyance at first that did not yet demand fury. He did not know then how the carriage's arrival would change the geometry of the town's loyalties. He did not know that the ledger and the sharing of it would set men to counting the cost. When the carriage door opened and a gentleman from the city stepped down with a stack of papers meant for the mines office, he did not expect to meet a woman who had nursed strangers until they lived. He did not expect those papers to be read by hands that would find the shortcuts and the falsified lines. He did not expect a quiet teacher to become an object lesson in courage. He did not know that Caleb's vow, made in a lamplit room after a fall, would one day stand like a single hinge on which the town's conscience pivoted. For now, the best they could do was prepare. They gathered witnesses one by one like small steady drops. They documented, they kept the children in school. They guarded the boarding house at night with lanterns and watchful, tired eyes. The truth, where it had been a whisper in margins, was a slow thing to collect. Its consequences would be heavier than any one man's fear. Caleb had sworn to keep her safe when he saw the evidence of the war written in her skin. He had not yet learned what keeping her safe would require of his name, his family, his life. The next move belonged to the ledger, and to those brave enough in Silver Ridge to read it aloud. The next move belonged to the ledger, and to those brave enough in Silver Ridge to read it aloud. They loaded the papers into a small trunk, as if they were lifelines. Mary Chen wrapped them in oilcloth and tied them with twine, the knot cinched tighter than any promise. Elinor sat with her fingers on the bundle and felt its cold, faintly papery weight. It was less the weight of ink than of consequence. Caleb watched her do this with a look that had moved from gratitude to something like dread. He had sworn to keep her safe when the lamplight had made her scars plain. He had not yet been forced to measure the cost that safety might extract. The road to Denver was a ribbon of rock and scrub, a place where thoughts loosen and then lay flat in the dust. Caleb rode at Elinor's side as if proximity were itself a watch. He had insisted on going with her, not because he believed the city would be more lenient than their town, but because there are promises that die if not honored by presence. The journey tested small things, how she fidgeted when carriages creaked, how she flinched reflexively at sudden clatter, but also made room for small gentleness, Caleb steadying a cup to her lips at a roadside inn, Elinor pressing a cloth into his calloused hand when he came back from standing in the rain to check the harness. At night, under the wing of a shared blanket and the small breath of a lamp, she would sometimes speak of the war so briefly it was almost a gesture, not a memory. "We did what we could," she would say. The phrase was an economy of grief. He learned that sometimes protection meant listening to a story that had no ending and bearing it as if it were a wound that needed tending. Denver had a different sound, a cadence of voices that assumed speed, a sense that news should not be kept waiting. Editor Mitchell received them in a paper room that smelled of ink and old coal. He was neither grand nor shifty. He was what his name suggested, a man who would take a fact and press it into shape. He read the ledger with the same kind of attention Dr. Morrison gave a malformed pulse. His pen traveled across his own pad, not to correct numbers, but to set up columns of question. He agreed to run a careful piece, not a slanderous broadsheet, but a sober listing of facts that would put light where leather had been used to hide joints. "You have to show me everything you have," he told Elinor, and she did. She showed him the ledger, Spence's bundle of receipts, Margaret's trembling notes, Morrison's brief formal observations about the pattern of misreported inspections. Mitchell did not flirt with heroism, he offered timeliness and reach. "If this is true," he said, "it ought to be the kind of story where a courthouse can do its work with witnesses and documents, not just hearsay shouted from porches." The article came out with a column that was measured and plain. It did not point a finger with glee. It asked questions the town had been too frightened to ask itself. Readers in Silver Ridge read it as if waking from a dream. Some squinted at the paragraph that suggested the possibility of falsified inspections. Others smoothed the paper like a child smoothing a blanket. Langford read it in his office with his hands folded over a ledger of a different kind. Figures, not guilt. He felt his face tighten in ways that money could not soothe. In the weeks that followed, words became actions. Federal marshals came, as Editor Mitchell had promised might happen if the case caught enough attention. They did not arrive as avenging angels, but as officers with clipped notes and a deft legal patience. They requested records, subpoenaed witnesses, and, most infuriatingly to Langford, put a pause on the mine's operations while safety inspections were conducted anew. For men whose daily bread came from shafts and carts, a pause could be a wound. Langford called this reasonable caution. Others called it necessary. Langford answered with the tools he had always used, a practiced civility and a steady, escalating pressure. He sent legal notices to the school, suggested, through polished letters and conversation, that Elinor's presence might be a liability. He visited the Reverend and brought a check that shined in its envelope like a bribe unspoken. To Langford, the ledger was not a moral indictment, but an operational headache. If men had been careless in their accounting, the company would do what it had to do to maintain work. In his mind, he had done much for the town. He had built homes, put bread on tables, kept a mill running. It is easy to see yourself as a steward when you have stacked enough coin to cover that word. Caleb felt the town tighten. Men he'd once sold hay to avoided his eyes in the feed store. Jamie, his brother, who had the steady patience of someone refused the luxury of anger, asked few questions but looked often at Caleb as if seeing him by inches. "You sure about this?" Jamie asked one night, voice small in the boarding house's kitchen. "Ain't no one hates the mine like we do, but men with mouths get fewer winters with full bellies." Caleb put a hand on his brother's shoulder, the touch brief, like an anchor. "I swore," he said simply. "I did." That vow, stone plain, was tested in ways neither of them had expected. The ledger revealed men's signatures that belonged to families with roofs made possible by a mine's payroll. It revealed, as documents sometimes do, that sin is not only the action of one man, but the small personal compromises that go into the machinery of a community. Caleb realized in stages that the truth was not merely a villain in a single office. It was a mesh of choices that included his neighbors. He had imagined protecting Elinor against a single enemy. He had not been prepared to protect her against the pulling apart of a town into factions. John Spencer's courage, for which he paid in the coin of sleeplessness and fear, produced more than paper. He risked his job retrieving a ledger from under an office floorboard and passing it through a window to a friend who left town before dawn. He did a dozen small, dangerous things, taking the foundry at night when the men had gone home, leaving footprints where none should have been, whispering names into the dark. He surprised even himself with the depth of what he could do. There came a night that held all the thin sharpness of danger, the kind that is not cinematic but intimate. Spencer had arranged a transfer of documents from the mine to a clerk in town who would carry them to Denver. The foundry's watchman had fallen asleep. The moon was a sliver that made everything half visible. Men with loyalties to Langford noticed a shadow where there should be none. A voice called, a dog barked, a lantern flared. For a minute, the world was the small sizzle of fear. Caleb and Jamie were there in the carriage, though neither liked the hiddenness of it. They watched as a hand passed a roll of papers into a saddlebag. A man stepped forward, and all of them froze for the fraction of the breath that belongs to a single decisive second. Sheriff Porter himself was there on foot, hat in hand, with a face the color of old leather. He did not shout. He did not lay hands on men. He looked at Spencer, and then at Caleb, and then at the bag of papers, and for the first time his public theatrum of being reasonable swayed into something like real moral calculus. "Best temper yourself," Porter said in a voice worn thin with the habit of diplomacy. It was neither sanction nor aid. It placed the responsibility on those who had made a choice. In the end, Porter did nothing dramatic to stop the transfer, but he did not call in a posse. For a man of his station, that small inaction was a kind of mercy and a kind of judgment. He left as if to smoke a cigarette behind the barn, and the courier rode off with the documents tight against his ribs. The papers reached Denver. Mitchell's journalists did their quiet work, checking dates, verifying signatures, cross-referencing purchase orders with receipts. They found a pattern. The engineer, Fletcher, had been recorded signing off on inspections that did not match the notes in the margins. Suppliers had been paid for cheaper timber. Men in the watch had made see no evil notes so the shaft could continue. The record did not contain one dramatic act of villainy. It contained a long arithmetic of shortcuts, each small sum making the shaft less safe. The trial that followed was not a melodrama. It was an exercise in patience and legal diligence. Langford hired counsel who were practiced in turning attention away from the central facts. A rustle of alternative explanations, a suggestion that accidents are accidents, that minds are risky by their very nature. But the prosecution, armed with documents and witnesses and the quiet, expert voice of Dr. Morrison, did not need to inflame the jury. It needed only to arrange evidence so plainly that it fit like a key in a lock. Fletcher's testimony was the fulcrum. He had been an engineer with a steady reputation until his name appeared on more past notations than the margins allowed. Initially, Fletcher took the stand with a face that had been taught the ease of obedience. He spoke of inspections and maintenance, of what could be done by men with time and what was left to wooden beams and luck. He sounded plausible because he had been trained to sound so. Langford's counsel framed him as a man who had merely made administrative errors, not as a conspirator in the subtle theft of safety. Elinor sat in the gallery when Fletcher spoke. She had not expected to be an object of attention in court. She had expected to be a witness, maybe a moral voice, but not a sort of symbol. She had been careful not to be. Her testimony, when asked, was not a soapbox. She spoke about the ledger as a document, about the pattern someone who had tended wounds might notice in structural failure. That a sudden collapse in a man-made hole often leaves marks inconsistent with a single deliberate blow. That timbers failed in ways that suggested rot or understrength rather than a sharp severance. Dr. Morrison spoke with clinical calm about the ledger's pattern and the signature of rushed repairs. Margaret Thornton, who had once monitored the town's bookkeeping and who then had looked away for fear of losing what she loved, stood and gave what everyone in the room felt to be the most difficult testimony. Her voice shook. She told of conversations she had overheard about cheaper wood and haggling over price that prioritized profit over sturdiness. "I should have said something sooner," she told the court. "I am sorry I did not." Then Fletcher began to unravel. It was not a dramatic confession in a single blazing moment. It was the accumulation of small inconsistencies teased out by a prosecutor with the patience of a surgeon. A clerk produced notes in a hand that matched Fletcher's drafting script. A receipt bore a thumbprint that tied the transactions to times Fletcher could not plausibly have been elsewhere. Under the careful pressure of question and counter-question, the engineer's face, which had at first been a mask of reason, crumpled in slow stages. He admitted haltingly that he had been asked to expedite inspections, to sign off on reports because the mine could not afford downtime. He spoke of the pressure he had felt from the office, of the fear of being labeled difficult, and of a small, persistent rationalization, that the economy needed the mine and that safety could be managed by later fixes. Caleb heard Fletcher and felt something break inside him that was not anger alone. It was the discovery that the truth did not always mirror the imagined geometry of enemies and friends. He had imagined Langford as the man at whose feet the town knelt. He had not known how many hands, some of them his neighbors' hands, had pushed the ledger into that shape. He felt suddenly that protecting Elinor required naming men whose faces he had known since boyhood, and whose gossip had once been part of the same Sunday dinners. Elinor's testimony thereafter was spare and precise. She did not plead. She laid out what she had seen and why the ledger mattered. She talked about duty, medical duty, and civic duty as obligations with consequences. "A life is not a ledger entry," she said quietly, and the sentence landed in the courtroom in a way that was neither theatrical nor small. It became, for some in the gallery, a moral point cleaved in practical terms, that wrongs measured in coin could kill the same as any sudden hand. In the end, the jury, swayed by paper and witness and the unvarnished arithmetic of receipts, found that the mine's practices had been negligent in ways that went beyond mere accident. Langford's counsel argued that intent had not been proven. The prosecution argued that patterns could be as telling as intentions. The judge, a man with a dry manner and a face like folded paper, rendered a decision that did not feel like triumph as much as consequence. Langford was indicted for falsifying safety records and for the economic endangerment of workers. The company faced heavy fines and a mandated restitution plan for families affected by the collapse. The mine's operations were subject to federal oversight and a period of closure while they corrected the problems. The fall of Langford was not cinematic. He did not go to prison in a pageant of weeping men. He sat quietly in his office the day his name was called in court as culpable. He paid fines and his public influence ebbed as men and families recalculated their own risks. Some in Silver Ridge tried to hold him. Others watched with a new certainty that money could not buy acquittal from fact. For Caleb, the legal victory was brittle and sweet. Sweet because truth had been vindicated, brittle because of what truth had required. There was an awkwardness in the days after the verdict. Families who depended on the mine's wages counted their money like a confession. Some turned away from former friends. Others came to terms with the idea that steady wages were not worth silence about safety. Margaret Thornton, who had given testimony that had made her a subject of gossip and resentment, found in a quiet way that some of the mothers who had once been fearful now crossed the street to lay hands upon hers. "We had to learn," one of them said as she left a basket on Margaret's step. "We had to learn to hold harder to what keeps us alive." Caleb and Elinor stood in the middle of this tearing and mending like two people with a shared seam. Their wedding was a small thing, no brass band, no grand sermon, celebrated on a September morning when the light was thin as linen and the creek ran clear. They were married in the churchyard with Reverend Mitchell saying words about covenant and duty that were more about community than creed. Langford did not attend. Jamie stood at Caleb's side as a witness to more than vows. His face betrayed a loss of easy certainties but also a steady pride. They married not because crisis had made them safe, but because they had decided to build in the midst of a town that was beginning, awkwardly, to learn other habits. The clinic they opened that winter was a modest thing. One room with a stove and a shelf of liniments, with Dr. Morrison acting as its backbone, and Mary Chen offering hot broths and a sharp tongue that kept men honest. It was not miraculous. It was practical, a place where bandages were changed and words of counsel were spoken for those who could not sleep. The school and the clinic combined in a small cooperative project, a fund to support miners' families during investigations and closures, a communal water pump so that the work of meeting need did not fall on a single person. They also did what lawyers and judges rarely bind. They set about to repair the social fabric. There were town meetings where men and women asked awkward questions and offered tentative apologies. There were families who refused to accept restitution out of a sense that no coin could truly pay for a life. And there were families who, with a pragmatic acceptance of the world's arithmetic, accepted what was offered to keep bread on the table. It was messy and human and necessary. Elinor and Caleb learned that protection is not merely the absence of harm, but the creation of structures that lower the chance of harm happening again. The spring that fed Creek Bend was a small miracle of ordinary water. For years its flow had been intermittent, parceled out to mills and to the main street. Caleb and Elinor, along with a handful of other farmers and merchants, organized a cooperative. They argued with stubbornness and then with compromise. The plan demanded that men who had once believed themselves insulated by ranks participate in a unified system that put the community ahead of a single owner's preference. When the pumps were turned on and the water ran steady into the community troughs, children who had once cut their tongues on thirst ran and laughed, and the sound braided into the water's movement. They built a clinic room where a small brass plaque read simply, "For those who count life more than coin." People came with knots in their shoulders and small grievances, and with children who scraped knees by the creek bank. They received bandaging and counsel. Elinor taught a class on first aid at the school in the afternoons, her hands moving with the same calm competence she had shown the night Caleb had fallen on the prairie. The children learned to knot cloth and to hydrate fevered brows. Caleb, whose hands remained rough from rope and saddle, learned to steady a trembling child's arm and discovered his own patience unspooling into something gentle. The town did not transform all at once. Langford's name lingered like a bruise. Some would never forgive. But the ledger had done what pages sometimes do. It had given language where silence had been profitable. A generation of churchgoers and mine men learned slowly that being part of a town meant acknowledging how things were done and compelling betterness by insistence, not by supplication. Reverend Mitchell, who had once accepted Langford's donations with a clerical smile, now worked with the council to propose a town charter that included safety oversight and a communal fund for emergencies. It was not a legal cure-all, but it was a structure, legal process in miniature, that awed doubters into an acceptance that law could be used to protect rather than simply to sanction. Caleb kept his vow in small, steady ways. He mended fences, yes, but also helped collect signatures, sat in meetings, and, when asked, stood across the hall from a witness in court and testified to the intimidation he had experienced. He learned that protection could mean stepping into the limelight and making public what had been private. He learned, with some hardness, that promises had to be paid with the coin of inconvenience, friendships strained, nights of worry, a staring down at a ledger that revealed the messy arithmetic of a small town. Elinor healed more slowly in the obvious senses. The pale ridges at her wrist and the line at her collar remained. Her sleep did not return whole for a long time, but there was a steadiness now, an acknowledgement that her scars had been seen and honored. There was also, to her own surprise, a kind of joy that came not from forgetting what she had known, but from turning that knowledge into care. She taught others to bandage and to be watchful. She taught the children to be citizens who might one day refuse to let a ledger be a substitute for human life. They had a child 2 years after the trial. Jamie was the first to announce it in the boarding house with a grin that made Mary clap like a delighted aunt. A boy, small and loud and stubborn from the first breath, who learned the sound of the creek, and for whom Elinor hummed songs that had no war in them. The house by the creek had rooms that smelled of broth and the dust of horses, and the child learned his first lessons at a table where the guests were a stable companionship of neighbors whose hands told of different trades. Langford, diminished in influence, eventually sold a portion of his holdings. He moved out of town and took with him a quiet bitterness that could not be reconciled by restitution. He wrote letters at times, at first threatening and then plaintive. They were answered through counsel and then left unanswered. He had defended a way of being that tied a town's existence to a single man. When that idea fell, he had a choice to remake himself or to retreat. He chose the latter. The town fared on. In the years that followed, Silver Ridge learned to embrace a different kind of reputation, one not merely of productivity, but of workmanship and accountability. The school came to celebrate the day the creek ran full once again with a picnic and a pie-eating contest, small civic pleasures that knitted edges. Margaret Thornton taught a bookkeeping class. Dr. Morrison, with his slow script and opinionated tea, taught a night class in hygiene. Mary Chen opened a second room at her boarding house for visiting families who needed to be near the clinic. The community had been forced by truth to rebuild some of its moral architecture. Caleb sometimes caught himself watching Elinor's hands when she worked, bandaging, demonstrating, answering a child's question with the same calm that had held him on the prairie. Once, standing at the edge of the creek as the children chased minnows, he heard the echo of the vow he had made years before and understood the full horizon of its meaning. He had been unready for the truth at the time he made it. He had imagined that the truth would be a single shape, like a man in a ledger. Instead, it was a braided thing, pulling in neighbors and kin, and the very economics of their lives. Protecting her, he had learned, meant not only guarding a woman against direct harm, but guarding the possibility that a town could change. It meant making sure the clinic stood even when the mind paused, that the schoolroom stayed open, that a ledger could be read without fear. It meant being willing to count the cost of telling the truth aloud. On a late afternoon years after the trial, when the creek ran wide from an unusually wet spring, and the willows at its bank had learned the drag of water in their leaves, Caleb and Elinor walked the path that followed Creek Ben. They had a child at their side and a dog that trotted without hurry. The spring fed a trough that bubbled into a small irrigation ditch, and then spread to gardens and to the pastures where horses grazed. The sound was steady, life-giving, and ordinary in the way that matters most. "You remember the night?" Elinor asked, her fingers cold but steady in his. He thought of lamplight and blood dark on prairie grass, of a woman who had tended him until he could stand. He remembered the vow made in a small room, and then he thought of the ledger that had forced men to speak, and of the town that had to learn a new kind of courage. He had not been ready for all of it then, the census of conscience, the tally of who would be hurt in seeking justice, but he had been ready to act. "I do," he said. "I swore I'd keep you safe." She smiled, and there was no need for grander words. "You did more than keep me safe," she said. "You kept a town honest. That is a different sort of protection." They stood for a long moment together, listening to the water. The edges of their lives, once ragged with separate battles, had become a seam worked by two hands. In the distance, children shouted and a dog barked. The field where he had once fallen was green and ordinary. The boarding house and the school and the small brick of the clinic smelled faintly of bread and medicine. Caleb reached for Elinor's hand and felt the ridges of her scar beneath the skin there. Nothing dramatic, just the history of living. He pressed his thumb there gently, as if reassuring paper into place. The promise he had made in a lamplit room had not saved them from reckoning, but it had made them choose the harder path. The truth had been harder than he imagined. It had asked of him family ties and friendship, and attendance in meetings where he needed to be patient rather than brash. It had also given them something steadier, a life in which they were accountable to each other, and to a community that had, imperfectly, learned how to take care. When the sun dropped low and the creek turned to gold, they walked back toward the house with the child between them. Behind them, the spring ran on, a small, unassuming miracle of supply. It fed the creek fed the town. The work of keeping people whole, legal filings, witness statements, small acts of mercy, had made this spring possible in a refuse of accounts world. The pledge Caleb had made to a woman with scars had become a caution, a charge, and a promise worked outward into the life of a town. Justice had not been a single verdict. It had been the slow accumulation of courage, the counting of names and dates and receipts, the willingness of a few to stand and tell what they knew. In the end, what had been required of Caleb was not only muscle or fury, but the hard, invisible labor of moral constancy. He had not been ready for the full truth when he first swore his vow, but in keeping it, he had learned the breadth of what protection could mean. If this story moved you, if the sight of people choosing truth over silence matters, leave a comment about the town you would defend and subscribe for more long-form tales of small places and hard choices.